Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by author Harriet Jacobs, otherwise known as Linda Brent, read by MariaMariaInc. Northerners know nothing about slavery. They think it is only perpetual bondage. They have no concept of the depth of degradation involved in that word, slavery. If they had, they would never cease their efforts until so horrible a system was overthrown. A woman of North Carolina. Rise up, ye women that are of ease. Hear my voice, ye careless daughters. Give ear unto my speech. Isaiah 9. Edited by L. Maria Child. Boston. Published for the author, 1861. Preface by the author. Reader, be assured this narrative is no fiction. I am aware that some of my adventures may seem incredible, but they are, nevertheless, strictly true. I have not exaggerated the words inflicted by slavery. On the contrary, my descriptions fall far short of the facts. I have concealed the names of places and given persons fictitious names. I have no motive for secrecy on my own account, but I deemed it kind and considerate towards others to pursue this course. I wish I were mere competent to the task I have undertaken, but I trust my readers will excuse deficiencies in considerations of circumstances. I was born and reared in slavery, and I remained in a slave state 27 years. Since I have been at the North, it has been necessary for me to work diligently for my own support and the education of my children. This has not left me much leisure to make up for the loss of early opportunities to improve myself, and it has compelled me to write these papers at irregular intervals, whenever I could snatch an hour from household duties. When I arrived in Philadelphia, Bishop Payne advised me to publish a sketch of my life, but I told him I was altogether incompetent to such an undertaking. Though I have improved my mind somewhat since that time, I still remain of the same opinion, but I trust my motives will excuse what might otherwise seem presumptuous. I have not written my experiences in order to attract attention to myself. On the contrary, it would have been more pleasant to me to have been silent about my own history. Neither do I care to excite sympathy for my own sufferings. But I do earnestly desire to arouse the women of the North to a realizing sense of the condition of 2 million women at the South, still in bondage, suffering what I suffered, and most of them far worse. I want to add my testimony to that of Albert Penns, to convince the people of the free states what slavery really is. Only by my experience can anyone realize how deep and dark and foul is the pit of abominations. May the blessing of God rest upon this imperfect effort in behalf of my persecuted people. Linda Brent. I would like to bestow upon you my interpretation of the readings of this great novel. Please enjoy Incidents in the Life of the Slave Girl, interpreted by MariaMariaInc. Thank you. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. 7 years concealed. Childhood. I was born a slave. But I never knew it till 6 years of happy childhood had passed away. My father was a carpenter and considered so intelligent and skillful in his trade that when buildings out of common line were to be erected, he was sent for from long distances to be the head workman, on condition of paying his mistress $200 a year and supporting himself. He was allowed to work at his trade and manage his own affairs. His strongest wish was to purchase his children, but though he several times offered his hard earnings for that purpose, he never succeeded. In complexion, my parents were a light shade of brownish yellow and were termed mulattoes. They lived together in a comfortable home and were all slaves. I was so finely shielded that I never dreamed I was a piece of merchandise trusted to them for safekeeping and liable to be demanded of them at any moment. I had one brother, William, who was 2 years younger than myself, a bright, affectionate child. I had also a great treasure in my maternal grandmother, who was a remarkable woman in many respects. She was the daughter of a planter in South Carolina who at his death left her mother and his 3 children free with money to go to St. Augustine, where they had relatives. It was during the Revolutionary War, and they were captured on their passage, carried back, and sold to different purchasers. Such was the story my grandmother used to tell me, but I don't remember all the particulars. She was a little girl when she was captured and sold to the keeper of a large hotel. I have often heard her tell of how hard she fared during childhood, but as she grew older, she evinced so much intelligence and was so faithful that her master and mistress could not help see it was for their interest to take care of such a valuable piece of property. She became an indispensable personage in the household, officiating in all capacities from cook and wet nurse to seamstress. She was much praised for her cooking, and her nice crackers became so famous in the neighborhood that many people were desirous of obtaining them. In consequence of numerous requests of this kind, she asked permission of her mistress to bake crackers at night after all her household work was done, and she obtained leave to do it, provided she clothed herself and her children from the profits. Upon these terms, after working hard all day for her mistress, she began her midnight bakings, assisted by her 2 oldest children. The business proved profitable, and each year she laid by a little, which she saved for a fund to purchase her children. Her master died, and the property was divided among his heirs. The widow had her dower in the hotel, which she continued to keep open. My grandmother remained in the service as a slave, but her children were divided among her master's children. As she had 5, Benjamin, the youngest one, was sold in order that each heir might have an equal portion of dollars and cents. There was so little difference in our ages that he seemed more like my brother than my uncle. He was bright, a handsome lad, nearly white, for he had inherited the complexion my grandmother had derived from Anglo-Saxon ancestors. Though only 10 years old, $720 were paid for him. His sale was a terrible blow to my grandmother, but she was naturally hopeful, and she went to work with a renewed energy, trusting in time to be able to purchase some of her children. She laid up $300, which her mistress one day begged as a loan, promising to pay her soon. The reader probably knows that no promise or writings given to a slave is legally binding, for according to Southern law, a slave, being property, can hold no property. When my grandmother lent her hard earnings to the mistress, she trusted solely to her honor, the honor of a slaveholder to a slave. To this grandmother, I was indebted for many comforts. My brother Willie and I often received portions of the crackers, cakes, and preserves she made to sell, and after we ceased to be children, we were indebted to her for many more important services. Such were the unusually fortunate circumstances of my childhood. When I was 6 years old, my mother died. And then for the first time, I learned by the talk around me that I was a slave. My mother's mistress was the daughter of my grandmother's mistress. She was the foster sister of my mother. They were both nourished at my grandmother's breast. In fact, my mother had been weaned at 3 months old that the babe of the mistress might obtain sufficient food. They played together as children, and when they became women, my mother was a most faithful servant to her white foster sister. On her deathbed, her mistress promised that her children would never suffer for anything, and during her lifetime she kept her word. They all spoke kindly of my dead mother, who was a slave merely in name, but in nature was a noble and womanly woman. I grieved for her, and my young mind was troubled with the thought of who would now take care of me and my little brother. I was told that my home was now to be with her mistress, and I found it a happy one. No toilsome or disagreeable duties were imposed upon me. My mistress was so kind to me that I was always glad to do her bidding, and proud to do labor for her as many as my young years would permit. I would sit by her side for hours, sewing diligently with a heart as carefree as that of any white-born free child. When she thought I was tired, she would send me out to run and jump, and away I would bound to gather berries and flowers to decorate her room. Those were the happy days. Too happy to last. The child slave had no thought for the morrow, but there came that blight which too surely awaits on every human being born to be a chattel. When I was nearly 12 years old, my kind mistress sickened and died. As I saw the cheek grow paler and the eyes more glassy, how earnestly I prayed in my heart that she might live. I loved her, for she had been almost like a mother to me. My prayers were not answered. She died, and they buried her in the little churchyard where day after day my tears fell upon her grave. I was sent to spend a week with my grandmother. I was now old enough to begin to think of the future. And again I asked myself, what would they do with me? I felt sure I should never find another mistress so kind as the one who was gone. She had promised my dying mother that her children should never suffer for anything. And when I remembered that and recalled her many proofs of attachment to me, I could not help having some hope that she had left me free. My friends were almost certain it would be so. They thought that she would be sure to do it on account of my mother's love and faithful service. But alas, we all know the memory of a faithful slave does not avail much to save her children from the auction block. After a brief period of suspense, the will of my mistress was read, and we learned that she had bequeathed me to her sister's daughter, a child of 5 years old. So vanquished our hopes. My mistress had taught me the precepts of God's word. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Whatsoever ye would that men should do unto you, do ye so unto them. But I was her slave, and I suppose she did not recognize me as her neighbor. I would give much to blot out from my memory that one great wrong. As a child, I loved my mistress, and I look back on the happy days I spent with her. I try to think with less bitterness of this act of injustice. While I was with her, she taught me to read and spell, and for this privilege which so rarely falls to the lot of a slave, I bless her memory. She possessed but few slaves, and at her death those were all distributed among her relatives. 5 of them were my grandmother's children, and had shared the same milk that nourished her mother's children. Notwithstanding my grandmother's long and faithful service to her owners, not one of her children escaped the auction block. These God-breathing machines are no more in the sight of their masters than the cotton they plant or the horses they tend. Chapter 2. The New Master and Mistress. Dr. Flint, a physician in the neighborhood, had married the sister of my mistress, and I now was the property of their daughter. It was not without murmuring that I prepared to go for my new home, and what added to my unhappiness was the fact that my brother William was purchased by the same family. My father, by his nature as well as by habit of transacting business as a skillful mechanic, had more of the feelings of a free man than is common among slaves. My brother was a spirited boy, and being brought up under such influences, he daily detested the name of Master and Mistress. One day, when his father and mistress both called to him at the same time, he hesitated between the two. Being perplexed to know which had the strongest claim upon his obedience, he finally concluded to go to the mistress. When my father reproved him for it, he said, "You both called me and I didn't know which one I ought to go to first." "You are my child," replied my father, "and when I call you, you should come immediately, if you have to pass through fire and water." Poor Willie. He was now to learn his first lesson of obedience to a master. Grandmother tried to cheer us with hopeful words, and they found an echo in credulous hearts of youth. When we entered our new home, we encountered cold looks, cold words, and cold treatment. We were glad when night came. On my narrow bed, I moaned and wept. I felt so desolate and alone. I had been there nearly a year when a dear little friend of mine was buried. I heard her mother sob as the clods fell on the coffin and her only child, and I turned away from the grave, feeling thankful that I still had something left to love. I met my grandmother, who said, "Come with me, Linda." And from her tone, I knew something sad had happened. She led me apart from the people and then said, "My child, your father is dead." Dead? How could I believe it? He had died so suddenly. I had not even heard that he was sick. I went home with my grandmother. My heart rebelled against God, who had taken my mother, father, mistress, and friend. The good grandmother tried to comfort me. "Who knows the ways of God?" she said. "Perhaps they had been kindly taken from the evil days to come." Years afterwards, I often thought of this. She promised to be a mother to her grandchildren, so far as she might be permitted to do so, and strengthened by her love, I returned to my masters. I thought I should be allowed to go to my father's house the next morning, but I was ordered to go for flowers, that my mistress's house might be decorated for an evening party. I spent the day gathering flowers and weaving them into festoons, while the dead body of my father was lying within a mile of me. What cared my owners for that? He was merely a piece of property. Moreover, they thought he had spoiled his children by teaching them to feel that they were human beings. This was blasphemous doctrine for a slave to teach, presumptuous in him and dangerous to the masters. The next day, I followed the remains to a humble grave beside that of my dear mother. There were those who knew my father's worth and respected his memory. My home now seemed more dreary than ever. The laugh of the little slave children sounded harsh and cruel. It was selfish to feel so about the joy of others. My brother moved about with a very grave face. I tried to comfort him by saying, "Take courage, Willie. Brighter days will come by and by." "You don't know anything about it, Linda," he replied. "We shall have to stay here all of our days. We shall never be free." I argued that we were growing older and stronger, and that perhaps we might before long be allowed to hire out our own time, and then we could earn money to buy our freedom. William declared that this was much easier to say than do. Moreover, he did not intend to buy his freedom. We held daily controversies upon this subject. Little attention was paid to slave meals in Dr. Flint's house. If they could catch a bit of food while it was going, well and good. I gave myself no trouble on that score, for on my various errands I passed my grandmother's house, where there was always something to spare for me. I was frequently threatened with punishment if I stopped there, and my grandmother, to avoid detaining me, often stood at the gate with something for my breakfast or my dinner. I was indebted to her for all of my comforts, spiritual or temporal. It was her labor that supplied my scantily clad wardrobe. I have a vivid recollection of her linsey woolly dress given to me every winter by Mrs. Flint. How I hated it. It was one of the badges of slavery. While my grandmother was thus helping to support me from her hard earnings, the $300 she had lent her mistress was never repaid. When her mistress died, her son-in-law, Dr. Flint, was appointed executor. When grandmother applied to him for payment, he said the estate was insolvent and the law prohibited payment. It did not, however, prohibit him from retaining the silver candelabra which he had purchased with that money. I presume they will be handed down in the family from generation to generation. My grandmother's mistress had promised her that at her death she would be free, and it was said that in her will she made good on that promise. But when the estate was settled, Dr. Flint told the old faithful servant, under existing circumstances, it was necessary that she should be sold. On the appointed day, the customary advertisement was posted up, proclaiming that there would be a public sale of Negroes, horses, and etc. Dr. Flint called to tell my grandmother that he was unwilling to wound her feelings by putting her up at auction, and that he would prefer to dispose of her at a private sale. My grandmother saw right through his hypocrisy. She stood very well that he was ashamed of the job. She was a very spirited woman, and if he was base enough to sell her, when her mistress intended she should be free, she was determined the public should know it. She had for a long time supplied many families with crackers and preserves. Consequently, Aunt Marthy, as she was called, was generally known, and everybody knew her, respected her intelligence and good character. Her long and faithful service in the family was well known, and her intentions of her mistress to leave her free. When the day of sale came, she took her place among the chattels, and at the first call she sprang upon the auction block. Many voices called out, "Shame! Shame! Who is going to sell you, Aunt Marthy? Don't stand there! That is no place for you!" Without saying a word, she quietly awaited her fate. No one bid for her. At last, a feeble voice said, $50. It came from a maiden lady, 70 years old, the sister of my grandmother's deceased mistress. She had lived 40 years under the same roof with my grandmother. She knew how faithfully she had served her owners and how cruelly she had been defrauded of her rights, and she resolved to protect her. The auctioneer waited for a higher bid, but her wishes were respected. No one bid above her. She could neither read nor write, and when the bill of sale was made out, she signed it with a cross. But what consequence was that when she had a big heart overflowing with human kindness? She gave the old servant her freedom. At that time, my grandmother was just 50 years old. Laborious years had passed since then, and now my brother and I were slaves to the man that had defrauded her of her money and tried to defraud her of her freedom. One of my mother's sisters, called Aunt Nancy, was also a slave in this family. She was a kind, good aunt to me and supplied the place of both housekeeper and waiting maid to her mistress. She was in fact at the beginning and end of everything. Mrs. Flint, like many Southern women, was totally deficient in energy. She had not strength to superintend her household affairs, but her nerves were so strong that she could sit in her easy chair and see a woman whipped till the blood trickled down from every stroke of the lash. She was a member of the church, but partaking of the Lord's Supper didn't seem to put her in a Christian frame of mind. If dinner was not served at the exact time on a particular Sunday, she would station herself in the kitchen and wait till it was dished up, and then spit in all the kettles and pans that was used for cooking. She did this to prevent the cook and her children from eking out the meager fare with the remains of the gravy and other scrapings. The slaves could get nothing to eat but what she chose for them. Provisions were weighed out by the pound and ounce 3 times a day. I can assure you she gave them no chance to eat wheat bread from her flour barrel. She knew how many biscuits a quart of flour would make and exactly what size they ought to be. Dr. Flint was an epicure. The cook never sent a dinner to his table without fear and trembling, for if there happened to be a dish not to his liking, he would either order her to be whipped or compel her to eat every mouthful of it in his presence. The poor hungry creature might not have objected to eating it, but she did object to having her master cram it down her throat till she choked. They had a pet dog, and he was a nuisance in the house. The cook was ordered to make some Indian mush for him. He refused to eat, and when his head was held over it, the froth flowed from his mouth into the basin. He died a few minutes after. And when old Dr. Flint came in, he said the mush had not been cooked well, and that was the reason that the animal would not eat it. He sent for the cook and compelled her to eat it. He thought that the woman's stomach was much stronger than a dog's, but her sufferings afterwards proved that he was mistaken. This poor woman endured so many cruelties from her master and mistress, Sometimes she was even locked up away from her nursing baby for the whole day and night. When I had been in the family for a few weeks, one of the plantation slaves was brought to town by the order of his master. It was near night when he arrived, and Dr. Flint ordered him to be taken to the workhouse and tied up to the joist so that his feet would just escape the ground. In this situation, he was to wait until the doctor had taken his tea. I shall never forget that night. Never before in my life have I heard hundreds of blows fall in succession on a human being. His piteous groans as his "Oh, pray, Master," rang out in my ears for months afterwards. There were many conjectures as to the cause of his terrible punishment. Some said Master accused him of stealing corn, and others said the slave quarreled with his wife in the presence of an overseer, and had accused his master of being the father of her child. They were both black, and the child was very fair. I went into the workhouse the next morning, and I saw the cowhide was still wet with blood, and the boards were all covered with gore. The poor man lived and continued to quarrel with his wife. A few months afterward, Dr. Flint handed them both over to a slave trader. The guilty man put their value in his pocket and had the satisfaction of knowing that they were going to be out of his sight and hearing. When the mother was delivered into the trader's hands, she said, "You promised to treat me well." To which he replied, "You have let your tongue run too damn far, damn you." She had forgotten that it was a crime for a slave to tell who the father of her child was. From others than the master's persecution also comes in such cases. I once saw a young slave girl dying soon after the birth of her child, nearly white. In her agony, she cried out, "Oh Lord, take me!" Her mistress stood by and mocked her like an incarnate fiend. "You suffer, do you?" she exclaimed. "I'm glad of it. You deserve it all and more too." The girl's mother said, "The baby is dead, thank God. And I hope my poor child will soon be in heaven too." "Heaven?" retorted the mistress. "There is no place for the like of her and her bastard." The poor mother turned away sobbing, her dying child feebly calling her. As she bent over her, I heard her say, "Don't grieve, mother. God knows all about it, and He will have mercy upon me." Her sufferings afterward became so intense that the mistress felt unable to stay. But when she left the room, the scornful smile was still on her lips. 7 children called her mother. The poor black woman had but one child, whose eyes she saw closing in death, while she thanked God for taking away from the great bitterness of life. Chapter 3. The Slave's New Year's Day. Dr. Flint owned a fine residence in town, several farms, and about 50 slaves, besides hiring a number by the year. Hiring day at the South takes place on the 1st of January. On the 2nd, the slaves are expected to go to their new masters. On a farm, they work until the corn and cotton are laid. Then they have 2 holidays. Some masters give them a good dinner under the trees. This over, they work until Christmas Eve. If no heavy charges are meantime brought against them, they're given about 4 or 5 holidays, whichever the master or overseer thinks is a proper thing to do. Then comes New Year's Eve, and they gather together all their little alls, or more properly speaking, their little nothings, and wait anxiously for the dawning of the day. At the appointed hour, the grounds are thronged with men, women, and children, waiting like criminals to hear their doom pronounced. The slave is sure to know who is the most humane or cruel master within 40 miles of him. It is easy to find out on that day who clothes and feeds their slaves well, for he is surrounded by a crowd begging, "Please, massa, hire me this year. I will work very hard, massa." If a slave is unwilling to go to his new master, he is whipped and locked up in jail until he consents to go and promises not to run away during the year. Should he chance to change his mind, thinking it unjustifiable to violate an extorted promise, woe unto him if he is caught. The whip is used until the blood flows at his feet and his stiffened limbs are put in chains to be dragged in the fields for days and days. If he lives until the next year, perhaps the same men will hire him again without even giving him an opportunity of going the hiring round. After those for hire are disposed of, those for sales are called up. Oh, happy you free women! Contrast your New Year's Day with that of the poor bound woman. With you is a pleasant season, and the light of day is blessed for you. Friendly wishes meet you wherever, and gifts are showered upon you. Even hearts that have been estranged from you soften for this season, and lips that have been silent echo back, "I wish you a happy new year." Children bring their little offerings and raise their rosy lips for caress. There you are on your own, and no hand but that of death can take them from you. But to the slave mother, New Year's Day comes laden with peculiar sorrows. She sits on the cold, hard cabin floor, watching her children, who may be all but torn from her on the next morning. And often she does wish that she might die before the day dawns. She may be an ignorant creature, degraded by the system that has brutalized her from childhood. But she has her mother's instincts and is capable of feeling a mother's agonies. On one of these sale days, I saw a mother lead 7 children to the auction block. She knew that some of them would be taken from her, but they took all. The children were sold to a slave trader, and their mother was bought by a man in her own town. Before night, her children were all far away. She begged the trader to tell her where he intended to take them. This he refused to do. How could he, when he knew he would sell them, one by one, wherever he could command the highest price? I met that mother in the streets, and her wild, haggard face lives today in my mind. She wrung her hands in anguish and exclaimed, "Gone! All gone! Why don't God kill me?" I had no words wherewith to comfort her. Instances of this kind are daily, yea, of hourly occurrence. Slaveholders have a method peculiar to this institution of getting rid of old slaves whose lives have been worn out in their service. I knew an old woman who was for 70 years faithfully serviced to her master. She had become almost helpless from the hard labor and disease. Her owners moved from Alabama, and the old black woman was left to be sold to anybody who would give $20 for her. Chapter 4. The Slave Who Dared to Feel Like a Man. 2 years had passed since I entered Dr. Flint's family, and those years had brought much of the knowledge that comes from experience, though they had afforded little opportunity for any other kinds of knowledge. My grandmother, as much as possible, had been a mother to her orphan grandchildren. By perseverance and unwearied industry, she was now mistress of a snug little home, surrounded with the necessaries of life. She would have been happy could her children have shared them with her. There remained but 3 children and 2 grandchildren, all slaves. Most earnestly did she strive to make us feel that that was the will of God, that He had seen fit to place us under such circumstances, and though it seemed hard, we ought to pray for contentment. It was a beautiful faith, coming from a mother who could not call her children her own. But I, in Benjamin, her youngest boy, condemned it. We reasoned that it was much more the will of God that we should be situated as she was. We longed for a home like hers. There were always sweet balms for our troubles. She was so loving, so sympathizing. She always met us with a smile and listened with patience to all of our sorrows. She spoke so hopefully that unconsciously the clouds gave place to sunshine. There was a grand big oven there, too, that baked breads and nice things for the town, and we knew there was always a choice bit in store for us. But, alas, even the charms of the old oven failed to reconcile us to our hard lot. Benjamin was now a tall, handsome lad, strongly and gracefully made, and with the spirit too bold and daring for a slave. My brother William, now 12 years old, had the same aversion to the word master that he had when he was an urchin of 7 years old. I was his confidant. He came to me with all his troubles. I remember one instance in particular. I was on a lovely spring morning, and when I marked the sunlight dancing here and there, its beauty seemed to mock my sadness. For my master, whose restless, craving, vicious nature roved about day and night, seeking whom to devour, had just left me with stinging, scorching words. Words that scathed the ear and brain like fire. Oh, how I despised him. I thought how glad I should be if some day when he walked the earth it would open up and swallow him up and disencumber the world of a plague. When he told me that I was made for his use, made to obey his commands in everything, that I was nothing but a slave, whose will must and should to surrender to his. Never before had my puny arm felt half as strong. So deeply was I absorbed in my painful reflections afterwards that I neither saw nor heard the entrance of anyone till the voice of William sounded close beside me. "Linda," said he, "what makes you look so sad?" "I love you." "Oh, Linda, isn't this a bad world? Everybody seems so cross and unhappy. I wish I had died when poor father did. I told him everybody was not cross or unhappy, that those who had pleasant homes, kind friends, and who were not afraid to love them, they were happy. But we, who were slave children, without father or mother, could not expect to be happy. We must be good, and perhaps that bring us some contentment. Yes, he said, I try to be good, but what's the use? They're all the time troubling me. Then he proceeded to relate this afternoon's difficulty with young Master Nicholas. It seemed that the brother of Master Nicholas had pleased himself with making up stories about William. Master Nicholas said he should be flogged and he would do it, whereupon when he went to work, but William fought bravely, and the young master, finding he was getting the better of him, undertook to tie his hands behind him. He failed in that likewise. By dint of kicking and fisting, William came out of the skirmish none the worse but for a few scratches. He continued to his discourse, and on his young master's meanness, how he whipped the little boys, but was a perfect coward when a tussle ensued between him and white boys of his own size. On such occasion, he always took to his legs. William had other charges to make against him. One was his rubbing up pennies with quicksilver and passing them off for quarters of $1 on an old man who kept a fruit stand. William was often sent to buy fruit, and he earnestly inquired of me what he ought to do under such circumstances. I told him it was certainly wrong to deceive the old man, and that it was his duty to tell him of the impositions practiced by his young master. I assured him the old man would not be slow to comprehend the whole, and the matter would end there. William thought it might end with the old man, but not with him. He said he didn't mind the smart of the whip, but he did not like the idea of being whipped. While I advised him to be good and forgiving, I was not unconscious of the beam in my own eye. It was the very knowledge of my own shortcomings that urged me to retain, if possible, some spark of my brother's God-given nature. I had not lived 14 years in slavery for nothing. I had felt, seen, and heard enough to read the characteristics and question the motives of those around me. The war of my life had begun, and though one of God's most powerless creatures, I resolved never to be conquered. Alas for me. If there was one pure, sunny spot for me, I believed it to be Benjamin's heart, and in another's, whom I loved with all the ardor of a girl's first love. My owner knew of it and sought it out in every way to render me miserable. He did not resort to corporal punishment, but to all the petty, tyrannical ways that human ingenuity could devise. I remember the first time I was punished. It was the month of February. My grandmother had taken my old shoes and replaced them with a new pair. I needed them. For several inches of snow had fallen, and it still continued to fall. When I walked through Mrs. Flint's room, their creaking grated harshly on her refined nerves. She called to me and asked what I had about me that made such a horrid noise. I told her it was my new shoes. "Take them off," she said, "and if you put them on again, I'll throw them in the fire." Well, I took them off, and my stockings also. She sent me on a long-distance errand, and as I went through the snow, my bare feet tingled. That night I was very hoarse, and I went to bed thinking the next day would find me sick, perhaps dead. What was my grief on waking to find myself quite well? I had imagined if I died or was laid up sometime that my mistress would feel a twinge of remorse, that she hated me so, the little imp as she styled me. It was my ignorance of the mistress that gave such rise to such extravagant imaginings. Dr. Flint occasionally had high prices offered for me, but he always said, "She belongs to my daughter. She's my daughter's property, and I have no right to sell her." Good, honest man. My young mistress was still a child, and I could look for no protection from her. I loved her, and she returned my affection. I once heard a father allude to her attachment to me, and his wife promptly replied that it was proceeded from fear. This put unpleasant doubts into my mind. Did the child feign what she did not feel? Or was her mother jealous of the mite of love she bestowed upon me? I concluded it must be the latter. I said to myself, surely little children are true. One afternoon I sat at my sewing, feeling unusual depression of my spirit. My mistress had been accusing me of an offense of which I assured her I was perfectly innocent. But I saw by the contemptuous curl of her lips that she believed that I was telling a lie. I wondered for what wise purpose God was leading me through such a thorny path, and whether still darker days were in store for me. As I sat musing, thus the door opened softly and William came in. "Well, brother," I said, "what's the matter this time?" "Oh, Linda, Ben and his master have had a dreadful time," he said. "My first thought was that Benjamin was killed." "Don't be frightened, Linda," William said. "I will tell you more about it." It appeared that Benjamin's master had sent for him, and he did not immediately obey the summons. When he did, his master was angry and began to whip him. He resisted. Master and slave fought, and finally the master was thrown. Benjamin had cause to tremble, for he had thrown his master to the ground, one of the richest men in town. I anxiously awaited the result. That night I stole to my grandmother's house, and Benjamin stole thither from his master. My grandmother had gone to spend a day or two with an old friend living in the country. "I have come," said Benjamin, "to tell you goodbye. I am going away." I inquired where. "To the north," he replied. I looked at him to see whether he was in earnest. I saw in his firm-set mouth. I implored him not to go, but he paid no heed to my words. He said he was no longer a boy, and every day made his yoke more galling. He had raised his hand against his master and was to be publicly whipped for that offense. I reminded him of the poverty and hardships he must encounter among strangers. I told him he might be caught and brought back, and that was terrible to think of. He grew vexed and asked if poverty and hardships with freedom were not preferable to our treatment in slavery. "Linda," he continued, "we are dogs here. Footballs, cattle, everything that's mean. No, I will not stay. Let them bring me back. We don't die but once." He was right, but it was hard to give him up. "Go," said I, "and break your mother's heart." I repented of my words ere they were out. "Linda," said he, speaking as I had not heard him speak that evening, "how could you say that? Poor mother. Be kind to her, Linda. And you too. and Cousin Fanny. Cousin Fanny was a friend who lived with us for some years. Farewells were exchanged, and the bright, kind boy, endeared to us by so many acts of love, vanished from our sight. It is not necessary to state how he made his escape. Suffice it to say, he was on his way to New York when a violent storm overtook his vessel. The captain said he must put into the nearest port. This alarmed Benjamin, who was aware that he would be advertised in every port near his town. His embarrassment was noticed by the captain. To the port they went. There, the advertisement met the captain's eye. Benjamin so exactly answered its description that the captain laid hold of him and bound him in chains. The storm passed, and they proceeded to New York. Before reaching that port, Benjamin managed to get off his chains and throw them overboard. He escaped from the vessel, but was pursued, captured, and carried back to his master. When my grandmother returned home and found her youngest child had fled, great was her sorrow. But with characteristic piety, she said, "God's will be done." Each morning she inquired if any news had been heard about her boy. Yes, news was heard. The master was rejoicing over a letter announcing the capture of the human chattel. That day seems but as yesterday. So well do I remember it. I saw him led through the streets in chains to jail. His face was ghastly pale, yet full of determination. He had begged one of the sailors to go to his mother's house and ask her not to meet him. He said the sight of her distress would take all self-control from him. She yearned to see him, and she went, but she screened herself in the crowd, that it might be as her child had said. We were not allowed to visit him, but we had known the jailer for years, and he was a kind-hearted man. At midnight, he opened the jail doors for my grandmother and myself to enter in disguise. When we entered the cell, not a sound broke the stillness. "Benjamin! Benjamin!" whispered my grandmother. No answer. "Benjamin!" She again faltered. There was a jingle of chains. The moon had just risen and cast a certain light through the bars of the window. We knelt down and took Benjamin's cold hands in ours. We did not speak. Sobs were heard, and Benjamin's lips were unsealed, for his mother was weeping on his neck. How vividly does memory bring back that sad night. Mother and son talked together. He asked her for her pardon for the suffering that he had caused her. She said that there was nothing to forgive. She could not blame his desires for freedom. He told her that when he was captured that he broke away and thought about casting himself into the river when thoughts of her came to him, and he desisted. She asked if he did not also think of God. I fancied I saw his face grow fierce in the moonlight. He answered, "No, I did not think of him. When a man is hunted like a wild beast, he forgets that there's a God in heaven. He forgets everything in his struggle to get beyond the reach of the bloodhounds." "Don't talk so, Benjamin," said she. "Put your trust in God. Be humble. my child, and your master will forgive you." "Forgive me? For what, mother? For not letting him treat me like a dog? No. I will never humble myself to him. I have worked for him for nothing all my life, and I am repaid with stripes and imprisonment. Here I will stay until I die, or till he sells me." The poor mother shuddered at the words. I think he felt that, for the next words he spoke, his voice was much calmer. "Don't fret about me, mother. I ain't worth it," said he. I wish I had some of your goodness. You bear everything so patiently. Just as though you thought it was all right. I wish I could." She told him she had not always been so, for once she was like him. But when sore troubles came upon her, she had no arms to lean on. She leaned on God, and he lightened her burdens. She besought him to do likewise. We overstayed our time and were obliged to hurry from the jail. Benjamin had been in prison for 3 weeks when my grandmother went to intercede for him with his master. He was immovable. He said Benjamin should serve as an example to the rest of the slaves. He should be kept in jail until he was subdued or be sold, even if he only got $1 for him. However, he afterwards relented in some degree. The chains were taken off, and we were allowed to visit him. As his food was often the coarsest kind, we carried him as often as possible a warm supper, accompanied with some luxuries, even for the jailer. 3 months elapsed, and there was no prospects of release or a purchaser. One day he was heard to sing and laugh. This piece of information was told to the master, and the overseer was ordered to rechain him. He was now confined in an apartment with other prisoners who were covered with filthy rags. Benjamin was chained near them and was soon covered with vermin. He worked at his chains until he was able to get out of them. He passed them through the bars with the request that they should be taken to his master, and he should be informed that he's covered with vermin. This audacity was punished with even heavier chains and prohibitions of our visit. My grandmother continued to send him fresh changes of clothes, and the old ones were burned up. The last night we saw him in jail, his mother still begged for him to send for his master and to beg for his pardon. Neither persuasion nor argument could turn him from his purpose. He calmly answered, "I am waiting his time." Those chains were mournful to hear. Another 3 months passed, and Benjamin left his prison walls. We that loved him waited to bid him a long and last farewell. A slave trader had bought him. You remember, I told you what price he brought when he was 10 years old. Now he was more than 20 years old and sold for only $300. The master had been blind to his own interests. Long confinement had made his face too pale, his form too thin. Moreover, the trader had heard something of his character, and it didn't strike him well, suitable for a slave. He had said he would have given any price if the handsome lad was a girl, and we thank God that he was not. Could you have seen that mother clinging to her child, well fastened the irons upon his wrists? Could you have heard her heart rendering groans and seen her bloodshot eyes wander wildly from face to face, vainly pleading for mercy? Could you have witnessed that scene as I saw it? You would exclaim, "Slavery is damnable." Benjamin, her youngest, her pet, was forever gone. She could not realize it. She had had an interview with the trader for the purpose of ascertaining if Benjamin could be purchased. She was told it was impossible, as he had given bonds not to sell him until he was out of the state. He had promised that he would not sell him until he'd reached New Orleans. With a strong arm and unvaried trust, my grandmother began her work of love. Benjamin must be free. If she succeeded, she knew they would still be separated, but the sacrifice was not too great. Day and night she labored. The trader's price would treble that he gave, but she was not discouraged. She employed a lawyer to write a gentleman whom she knew in New Orleans. She begged him to interest himself in Benjamin, and he willingly favored her request. When he saw Benjamin and stated his business, he thanked him, but said he preferred to wait a while before making the trader an offer. He knew he had to obtain a high price for him and had invariably failed. This encouraged him to make another effort for freedom. So one morning, long before day, Benjamin was missing. He was riding over the blue billows, bound for Baltimore. For once his white face did him a kindly service. They had no suspicions that it belonged to a slave. Otherwise, the law would have been followed to the letter, and the thing rendered back to slavery. The brightest skies are often overshadowed by the darkest clouds. Benjamin was taken sick and compelled to remain in Baltimore 3 weeks. His strength was slowly returning, and his desire to continue his journey seemed to retard his recovery. How could he get strength without exercise and air? He resolved to venture on a short walk. A by-street was selected where he thought himself secure, not being met by anybody that knew him, but a voice called out, "Hello, Ben, my boy. What are you doing here?" His first impulse was to run, but his legs trembled so that he could not stir. He turned to confront the antagonist, and behold, there stood his old master's next-door neighbor. He thought it was all over for him now, but it proved otherwise. That man was a miracle. He possessed a godly number of slaves, and yet was quite deft at the mystic clock, whose ticking is rarely heard in a slaveholder's breast. "Ben, you're sick," he said. "Why, you look like a ghost. I guess I gave you something of a start. Never mind, Ben. I'm not going to touch you. You had a pretty tough time of it, and you may go on your way rejoicing for all of me. But I would advise you to get out of this place quick, for there are several gentlemen here from our town." He described the nearest and safest route to New York and added, "I shall be glad to tell your mother I have seen you. Goodbye, Ben." Benjamin turned away, filled with gratitude and surprised that the town he hated contained such a gem worthy of a purer setting. This gentleman was a northerner by birth and had married a southern lady. On his returns, he told my grandmother that he had seen her son and of the service that he rendered him. Benjamin reached New York safely and concluded to stop there until he gained strength enough to proceed further. It happened that my grandmother's only remaining son had sailed for the same city for business for his mistress. Through God's providence, the brothers met. You may be sure it was a happy meeting. "Oh, Phil," exclaimed Benjamin, "I am here at last." Then he told him how he came near dying, almost in sight of free land, and how he prayed that he might live to have one breath of free air. He said his life was worth something now, and it would be hard to die. In the old jail, he had not valued it, and once had tempted to destroy it, but something, he did not know what, had prevented him. Perhaps it was fear. He had heard that those who professed to be religious declared that there's no heaven for self-murderers, and his life had been pretty hot here. He did not desire a continuation of the same in another world. "If I die now," he exclaimed, "thank God I'll die a freeman." He begged my Uncle Philip not to return to the South, but stay and work with him till they earned enough to buy a house. His brother told them it would kill their mother if he deserted her in her trouble. She had pledged her house with difficulty and raised money to buy him. Would he be bought? "No, never," he replied. "Do you suppose, Phil, I have got so far out of their clutches that I would give them 1 red cent? No. And do you suppose I would turn mother out of her home in her old age, that I would let her pay those hard-earned dollars for me and never to see me? For you know she will stay South as long as her other children are slaves. What a good mother. Tell her to buy you, Phil. You have been a comfort to her, and I have been trouble. And Linda, poor Linda, what will become of her? Phil, you know what life they lead her. She has told me something about it, and I wish Mr. Old Flint was dead, or a better man. When I was in jail, he asked her if she didn't want him to ask my master to forgive me and take me home again. She told him no, that I didn't want to go back. He got mad and said we were all alike. I never despised my own master half as much as I do that man. There is many worse slaveholders than my master, but for all that I would not be his slave. While Benjamin was sick, he parted with nearly all of his clothes to make necessary expenses, but he did not part with the little pin I fastened in his bosom when we parted. It was the most valuable thing I owned, and I thought none more worthy to wear it. He still had it. His brother furnished him with clothes and gave him all the money he had. They parted with moistened eyes, and as Benjamin turned away, he said, "Phil, I part with all my kindred." And so it proved. We never heard from him again. Uncle Philip came home, and the first words he uttered when he entered the house, "Mother, Ben is free. I have seen him in New York." She stood looking at him with a bewildered air. "Mother, don't you believe it?" he said, laying his hands softly on her shoulders. She raised her hands and exclaimed, "God be praised! Let us thank him!" She dropped to her knees and poured forth her heart in prayer. Then Philip sat down and repeated every word Benjamin had said. He told her all, only he forbore to mention how pale and sick her darling looked. Why should he distress her when there's no good she could do to him? The brave old woman toiled on, hoping to rescue some of her other children. After a while, she succeeded in buying Philip. She paid $800 and came home with the precious document that secured his freedom. The happy mother and son sat together in the old hearthstone that night, telling how proud they were of each other and how they would prove to the world that they could take care of themselves as long as they had taken care of others. We all concluded by saying, "He that is willing to be a slave, let him be a slave." Chapter 5. The Trials of Girlhood. During the first years of my service in Dr. Flint's family, I was accustomed to share some indulgences with the children of my mistress. Though this seemed to me no more than right, I was grateful for it and tried to merit the kindness by faithful service of discharge of my duties. But I now entered in on my 15th year, a sad year in the life of a slave girl. my master began to use foul words in my ear. Young as I was, I could not remain ignorant of their import. I tried to treat them with indifference or contempt. The master's age, my extreme youth, and the fear that his conduct would be reported to my grandmother made me bear this treatment for many months. He was a crafty man and resorted to many means to accomplish his purposes. Sometimes he had stormy, terrific ways that made his victims tremble. Sometimes he assumed a gentleness that he thought must surely subdue. Of the two, I preferred his stormy moods, although they left me trembling. He tried his utmost to correct the pure principles my grandmother had instilled. He peopled my young mind with unclean images, such as only a vile monster could think of. I turned from him with disgust and hatred. But he was still my master. I was compelled to live under the same roof with him, where I saw a man 40 years my senior daily violating the most sacred commandments of nature. He told me I was his property and that I must subject to his will in all things. My soul revolted against the mean tyranny. But where could I turn for protection? No matter whether the slave girl be as black as ebony or as fair as her mistress. In either case, there is no shadow of law to protect her from insult, from violence, or even from death. All these things are inflicted by fiends who bear the shape of men. The mistress, who ought to protect the helpless victim, has no other feelings towards her but those of jealousy and rage. The degradation, the wrongs, the vices that grow out of slavery are more than I can describe. They are greater than you would willingly believe. Surely, if you credited one half the truths that you are told concerning the helpless millions suffering in this cruel bondage, you at the North would not help to tighten the yoke. You surely would refuse to do for the master on your own soil the mean and cruel work which trained bloodhounds and the lowest class of whites do for him at the South. Everywhere the years bring to all enough of sin and sorrow. But in slavery, the very dawn of life is darkened by these shadows. Even the little child who is accustomed to wait on her mistress and her children will learn, before she's 12 years old, why it is her mistress hates such and such among the slaves. Perhaps the child's own mother is one of the hated ones. She listens to violent outbreaks of jealous passion and cannot help but understand what is that cause. She will become prematurely knowing of evil things. Soon she will learn to tremble when she hears her master's footfall. She will be compelled to realize that she is no longer a child. If God has bestowed beauty upon her, it will prove to be her greatest curse. That which commands admiration in the white woman only hastens the degradation of the female slave. I know that some are too much brutalized by slavery to feel the humiliation of their positions, but many slaves feel it more acutely, and they shrink from the memory of it all. I cannot tell you how much I suffered in the presence of these wrongs, nor how much I still feel pained by the retrospect. My master met me at every turn, reminding me that I belonged to him, and swearing by heaven and earth that he would compel me to submit. If I went out for a breath of fresh air, after a day of unwearied toil, his footsteps dogged me. If I knelt by my mother's grave, his dark shadow fell upon me even there. The light heart which nature had given me became heavy with sad forebodings. The other slave in my master's house noticed the change. Many of them pitied me, but none dared to ask the cause. They had no need to inquire. They knew too well the guilty practices under that roof, and they were aware to speak of them was an offense that never went unpunished. I longed for someone to confide in. I would have given the world to have laid my head upon my grandmother's faithful bosom and told her all my troubles. But Dr. Flint swore he would kill me if I was not silent as the grave. Then, although my grandmother was all in to me, I feared, as her love for me was all well. I had been accustomed to look to her with a retrospect almost bordering in awe. I was very young and felt shamefaced upon telling her such impure things, especially as I knew her to be very strict upon such subjects. Moreover, she was a woman of high spirit. She was usually very quiet in her demeanor, but if her indignation was once roused, it was not very easily quelled. I had been told once that she chased a white gentleman with a loaded pistol because he insulted one of her daughters. I dreaded the consequences of a violent outbreak, and both pride and fear kept me silent. But though I did not confide in my grandmother, and even invaded her vigilant watchfulness and inquiry, her presence in the neighborhood was some protection for me. Though she had been a slave, Dr. Flint was afraid of her. Her dreaded scorching rebukes. Moreover, she was known and patronized by many people, and he did not wish to have his villainy made public. It was lucky for me that I did not live on a distant plantation, but in a town not so large that the inhabitants were ignorant of each other's affairs. Bad as the laws and customs were in slaveholding communities, the doctor, as a professional man, deemed it prudent to keep up some outward show of decency. Oh, what days and nights of fear and sorrow that man caused me. Reader, it is not to awaken sympathy for myself that I'm telling you truthfully what I suffered in slavery. I do it to kindle a flame of compassion in your hearts for my sisters who are still in bondage, suffering as I once suffered. I once saw two beautiful children playing together. One was a fair white child. The other was her slave and also her sister. When I saw them embracing each other and heard their joyous laughs, I turned sadly from the lovely sight. I foresaw the inevitable blight that will fall on the little slave's heart. I knew how soon her laughter would be changed to sighs. The fair child grew up to be still a fairer woman. From childhood to womanhood, her path was blooming with flowers and overarched by a sunny sky. Scarcely one day of her life had been clouded when the sun rose on her happy bridal morning. How had those years dealt her, slave sister, the playmate of her childhood? She also was very beautiful, but the flowers and sunshine of love were not for her. She drank the cup of sin and shame and misery, whereof her persecuted race are compelled to drink. In view of these things, why are ye silent, ye free men and women of the North? Why do your tongues falter in maintenance of our right? Would that I had more ability, but my heart is so full and my pen is so weak. There are noble men and women who plead for us, striving to help those who cannot help themselves. God bless them. God give them strength and courage to go on. God bless those everywhere who are laboring to advance the cause of humanity. Chapter 6. The Jealous Mistress. I would 10,000 times rather that my children should be the half-starved paupers of Ireland than to be the most pampered among the slaves of America. I would rather drudge out my life on a cotton plantation till the grave opened up to give me rest than to live with an unprincipled master and a jealous mistress. The felon's home in a penitentiary is preferable. He may repent and turn from the error of his ways and so find peace. But it is not so with a favorite slave. She is not allowed to have any pride of character. It is deemed a crime in her to wish to be virtuous. Mrs. Flint possessed the key to her husband's character before I was born. She might have used this knowledge to counsel and screen the young and the innocent among her slaves. But for them she had no sympathy. They were the objects of her constant suspicion and malevolence. She watched her husband with unceasing vigilance, but he was well practiced in the means to evade it. What he could not find opportunity to say in words, he manifested in signs. He invented more than there were ever at a deaf and dumb asylum. I let them pass as if I didn't understand what he meant. And many were the curses and threats bestowed upon me for my stupidity. One day, he caught me teaching myself to write. He frowned as if he was not well pleased, but I suppose he came to the conclusion that such an accomplishment might help to advance his favorite scheme. Before long, notes were often slipped into my hand. I would return them saying, "I can't read them, sir." "Can't you?" he replied. "Then I must read them to you." He always finished the reading by asking, "Do you understand?" Sometimes he would complain of the heat of the tea room and order his supper to be placed on a small table in the piazza. He would seat himself there with a well-satisfied smile and tell me to stand by and blush away the flies. He would eat very slowly, pausing between mouthfuls. These intervals were employed in describing the happiness I was so foolishly throwing away, and in threatening me with a penalty that finally awaited my stubborn disobedience. He boasted much of the forbearance he had exercised towards me, and reminded me that there was a limit to his patience. When I succeeded in avoiding opportunities for him to talk to me at home, I was ordered to his office to do some errands. When there, I was obliged to stand and listen to such language as he saw fit to address me. Sometimes I openly expressed my contempt for him, and he would become violently enraged, and I wondered why he did not strike me. Circumstanced as he was, he probably thought it was better policy for him to be forbearing. But the state of things grew worse and worse daily. In desperation, I told him that I must and would apply to my grandmother for protection. He threatened me with death, and worse than death, if I made any complaint to her. Strange to say, I did not despair. I was naturally of a buoyant disposition, and I always had hope of somehow getting out of his clutches. Like many poor, simple slaves before me, I trusted that some thread of joy would yet be woven into my dark destiny. I had entered my 16th year, and every day it became more apparent that my presence was intolerable to Mrs. Flint. Angry words frequently passed between her and her husband. He had never punished me himself, and he would not allow anybody else to punish me. In that respect, she was never satisfied. But in her angry moods, no terms were too vile for her to bestow upon me. Yet I, whom she detested so bitterly, had far more pity for her than he had, whose duty it was to make her life happy. I never wronged her, or wished to wrong her, and one kind word from her would have brought me to her feet. After repeated quarrels between the doctor and his wife, he announced his intention to take his youngest daughter, then 4 years old, to sleep in his apartment. It was necessary that a servant should sleep in the same room to be on hand if the child should stir. I was selected for that office and informed for what purpose that arrangement had been made. By managing to keep within sight of people as much as possible during the day, I had hitherto succeeded in eluding my master, though a razor was often held to my throat to force me to change this line of policy. At night, I slept by the side of my great aunt. To save appearances, to some degree, I felt safe there, and he was too prudent to come into her room. She was an old woman and had been in the family for many, many years. Moreover, as a married man and a professional, he wanted to save face to some degree. But he resolved to remove the obstacles in the way of his scheme, and he thought that he had planned it so should he evade suspicion. He was well aware of how much I prized my refuge by the side of my old aunt, and he determined to dispossess me of it. The first night, the doctor had the little child in his room all alone. The next morning, I was ordered to take my station as the nurse the following night. But a kind providence interposed in my favor. During the day, Miss Flint had heard of this arrangement. A storm followed, and I rejoiced to hear it rage. After a while, my mistress sent for me to come to her room. Her first question was, "Did you know that you were to sleep in the doctor's room?" "Yes, ma'am." "Who told you?" "My master." "Will you answer truly all the questions that I ask?" "Yes, ma'am." "Tell me then, as you hope to be forgiven, are you innocent of what I have accused you?" "I am." She handed me a Bible and said, "Lay your hand on your heart, kiss this holy book, and swear before God that you tell me the truth." I took the oath as she required, and I did it with a clear conscience. "You have taken God's holy word to testify your innocence," she said. "If you have deceived me, beware. Now take this stool, sit down, look me directly in my face, and tell me all that has passed between you and your master." I did as she ordered. As I went on with my account, her color changed frequently. She wept and sometimes groaned. She spoke in tones so sad that I was touched by her grief. The tears came to my eyes.
but I was soon convinced that her emotions arose from anger and wounded pride. She felt that her marriage vows were desecrated, her dignity insulted, but she had no compassion for the poor victim of her husband's perfidy. She pitied herself as a martyr, but she was incapable of feeling for the condition of shame and misery in which her unfortunate, helpless slave was placed. Yet perhaps she had some touch of feelings for me, for when the conference ended, she spoke kindly and promised to protect me. I should have been much comforted by the assurance if I could have had confidence in it. But my experiences in slavery had filled me with distrust. She was not a very refined woman and had not much control over her passions. I was the object of her jealousy and consequently of her hatred. And I knew I could not expect kindness or confidence from her under circumstances in which I were placed. I could not blame her. Slaveholders' wives feel as other women would under such circumstances. The fire of her temper kindled from small sparks, and now the flame became so intense that the doctor was obliged to give up his intended arrangement. I knew I had ignited the torch, and I expected to suffer for it afterwards. But I was too thankful to my mistress for her timely aid she rendered me to care too much about that. She now took me to sleep in a room adjoining hers. There, I was the object of her special care, though not of her special comfort, for she spent many a sleepless nights to watch over me. Sometimes I woke up and found her bending over me. At other times she whispered in my ear as though it was her husband who was speaking to me, and listened to hear what I would answer. If she startled me, on such occasions she would glide stealthily away, and the next morning she would tell me I had been talking in my sleep and ask who I was talking to. At last I began to fear for my life. It had been often threatened, and you can imagine better than I can describe what an unpleasant sensation it must produce to wake up in the dead of the night and find a jealous woman bending over you. Terrible as this experience was, I had fears that it would give place to one more terrible. My mistress grew weary of her vigils. They did not prove satisfactory, so she changed her tactics. She now tried the trick of accusing my master of crime in my presence and gave my name as the author of the accusation. To my utter astonishment, he replied, "I don't believe it. But if she did acknowledge it, you tortured her into exposing me." Tortured into exposing him? Truly, Satan had no difficulty in distinguishing the color of his soul. I understood his object in making this false representation. It was to show me that I had gained nothing by seeking the protection of my mistress, that the power was still all in his hands. I pitied Mrs. Flint. She was a second wife, many years the junior of her husband, and the hoary-headed miscreant was enough to try the patience of a wiser and a better woman. She was completely foiled and knew not how to proceed. She would have gladly flogged me for my supposed false oath, but, as I have already stated, the doctor never allowed anyone to whip me. The old sinner was politicked. The application of the lash might have led to remarks that would have exposed him in the eyes of his children and grandchildren. How often did I rejoice that I lived in a town where all the inhabitants knew each other. If I had been on a remote plantation or lost among the multitude of a crowded city, I should not be a living woman today. The secrets of slavery are concealed like those of the Inquisition. My master was, to my knowledge, the father of 11 slaves. But did the mothers dare to tell who the father of their children were? Did the other slaves dare to allude to it, except in whispers among themselves? No, indeed. They knew too well the terrible consequences. My grandmother could not avoid seeing things which excited her suspicions. She was uneasy about me and tried various ways to buy me. But the never-changing answer was always repeated. Linda does not belong to me. She is my daughter's property, and I have no legal right to sell her. The conscientious man. He was too scrupulous to sell me, but had no scruples whatsoever about committing a much greater wrong against the helpless young girl placed under his guardianship as his daughter's property. Sometimes my persecutor would ask me whether I would like to be sold. I told him I would rather be sold to anybody than to lead such a life as I did. On such occasions, he would assume the air of a very injured individual and reproach me for my ingratitude. Did I not take you into the house and make you the companion of my own children? He would say. Have I ever treated you like a Negro? I have never allowed you to be punished, not even to please your mistress. And this is the recompense I get, you ungrateful girl? I answered that he had his own reasons for screening me for punishment, and that the course he pursued made my mistress hate me and persecute me. If I wept, he would say, Poor child, don't cry, don't cry. I will make peace for you with your mistress. Only let me arrange matters in my own way. You poor foolish girl. You don't know what's good for you. I would cherish you. I would make a lady out of you. Now go and think of all the things that I have promised you. I did think of it. Rita, I draw no imaginary pictures of Southern homes. I'm telling you the plain truth. Yet when victims make their escape from the wild beast of slavery, Northerners consent to act the part of bloodhounds and hunt the poor fugitives back into this den, full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Nay, more, they are not only willing but proud to give their daughters in marriage to slaveholders. The poor girls have romantic notions of a sunny clime and of flowering vines that all year round shade a happy home. To what disappointments are they destined? The young wife soon learns that her husband, in whose hands has she placed her happiness, pays no regard to his marriage vows. Children of every shade of complexion play with her own fair babies, and too well she knows that they are born unto him of his own household. Jealousy, hatred, both enter her flowery home, and it is ravaged, the loveliness of it. Southern women often marry a man knowing that he is the father to many little slaves. They do not trouble themselves about it. They regard such children as property, as marketable as the pigs on the plantation, and it is seldom that they do not make them aware of this by passing them into the slave traders' hands as soon as possible, and thus getting them out of their sight. I am glad to say there are a few honorable exceptions. I have myself known 2 Southern wives who exhorted their husbands to free those slaves towards whom they stood in a parental relation, and their requests were granted. These husbands blushed before the superior nobleness of their wives' nature. Though they had only counseled them to do what was right and in their duty to do, It commanded their respect and rendered their conduct more exemplary. Concealment was at the end, and confidence took the place of distrust. Though this bad institution deadens the moral sense, even in white women, to a fearful extent, it is not altogether extinct. I have heard Southern ladies say of Mr. Such and Such, he not only thinks it's no disgrace to be the father of those little niggers, but he is ashamed to call himself their master. I declare, such things ought to not be tolerated in any decent society.
Chapter 7. The Lover. Why does a slave ever love? Why allow the tendrils of the heart to twine around objects which may at any moment be wrenched away by the hand of violence? When separations come by the hand of death, the pious soul can bow in resignation and say, "Not my will, but thine be done, O Lord." But when the ruthless hand of man strikes the blow, regardless of the misery he causes, it is hard to be submissive. I did not reason thus when I was a young girl. Youth will be youth. I loved and I indulged the hope that the dark clouds around me would turn out with a bright lining. I forgot that in the land of my birth the shadows are too dense for the light to penetrate. A land where laughter is not mirth, nor thought the mind, nor words a language, nor in men mankind, where cries reply to curses, shrieks to blows, and each is tortured in his separate hell. There was in the neighborhood a young colored carpenter, a free-born man. We had been well acquainted in childhood and frequently met together afterwards. We had become mutually attached, and he proposed to marry me. I loved him with all the ardor of a young girl's first love. But when I reflected that I was a slave, and that the laws gave no sanction to the marriage of such, my heart sank within me. My lover wanted to buy me, but I knew that Dr. Flint was too willful and arbitrary a man to consent to that arrangement. From him, I was sure of experiencing all sorts of opposition, and I had nothing to hope from my mistress. She would have been delighted to get rid of me, but not in that way. It would have relieved her mind of a burden if she could have seen me sold to some distant state. But if I was married near home, I should be just as much in her husband's power as I had previously been. For the husband of a slave has no power to protect her. Moreover, my mistress, like many others, seemed to think that slaves had no right to any family ties of their own, that they were merely created to wait upon the family of the mistress. I once heard her abuse a young girl who told her that a colored man wanted to make her his wife. "I will have you peeled and pickled, my lady," she said, "if I ever hear you mention that subject again. Do you suppose that I will have you tending my children with the children of that nigger?" The girl to whom she said this had a mulatto child, of course not acknowledged by its father. The poor black man who loved her would have been proud to acknowledge his helpless offspring. Many and anxious were the thoughts that revolved in my mind. I was at a loss of what to do. Above all things, I was desirous to spare my lover the insults that had cut so deeply into my own soul.
I talked with my grandmother about it and partly told her my fears. I did not dare tell her the worst of it. She had long suspected all was not right, and if I confirmed her suspicions, I knew a storm would rise that would prove to overthrow all of my hopes. This love dream had been my support through many trials, and I could not bear the risk of having it suddenly dissipated. There was a lady in the neighborhood, a particular friend of Dr. Flint's, who often visited the house, and I had great respect for her, and she always manifested a friendly interest in me. Grandmother thought she would have a great influence with the doctor, so I went to this lady and told her my story. I told her I was aware that my lover's being a freeborn man would prove a great objection, but he wanted to buy me, and if Dr. Flint would consent to the arrangement, I felt sure he would be willing to pay any reasonable price. She knew that Mrs. Flint disliked me, therefore I ventured to suggest that perhaps my mistress would approve of my being sold, as that would rid her of me. The lady listened with kindly sympathy and promised to do her utmost to promote my wishes. She had an interview with the doctor, and I believe she pleaded my case earnestly. But it was to no purpose. How I dreaded my master now. Every minute I expected to be summoned to his presence. But the day passed, and I heard nothing from him. The next morning, a message was brought to me. Master wants you in his study. I found the door ajar, and I stood a moment gazing at the hateful man who claimed to rule me body and soul. I entered and tried to appear calm. I did not want him to know how my heart was bleeding. He looked fixedly at me with an expression that seemed to say, "I have half a mind to kill you on the spot." At last he broke the silence, and that was a relief to both of us. "So, you want to be married, do you?" said he. "And to a free nigger?" "Yes, sir." "Well, I'll soon convince you whether I am your master or the nigger fellow you honor so highly. If you must have a husband, you may take up with one of my slaves." What a situation I should be in as the wife of one of his slaves, even if my heart had been interested. I replied, "Don't you suppose, sir, that a slave can have some preference about marrying? Do you suppose that all men are alike to her?" "Do you love this nigger?" said he abruptly. "Yes, sir." "How dare you tell me so?" He exclaimed in great wrath. After a slight pause, he added, "I suppose you thought more of yourself, that you felt the insult of such puppies." I replied, "If he is a puppy, I am a puppy, for we are both of the Negro race. It is right and honorable for us to love each other. The man you call puppy never insulted me, sir, and he would not love me if he did not believe me to be a virtuous woman." He sprang upon me like a tiger and gave me a stunning blow. It was the first time that he had ever struck me, and fear did not enable me to control my anger. When I had recovered a little from the side effects, I exclaimed, "You have struck me for answering you honestly! How I despise you!" There was a moment of silence. Perhaps he was deciding what should be my punishment, Or perhaps he wanted to give me a time to reflect on what I had said and to whom I had said it. Finally, he asked, "Do you know what you have said?" "Yes, sir, but your treatment drove me to it." "Do you know that I have a right to do with you as I like, that I can kill you if I please?" "You have tried to kill me, and I wish you had, but you have no right to do with me as you like." "Silence!" he exclaimed in a thundering voice. "By heavens, girl, you forget yourself too far. Are you mad? If you are, I will soon bring you to your senses. Do you think any other master would bear what I have borne from you this morning? Many masters would have killed you on the spot. How would you like to be sent to jail for your insolence?" "I know I have been disrespectful, sir," I replied, "but you drove me to it. I couldn't help it. As for jail, there would be more peace for me there than there is here." "You deserve to go there," said he, "and to be under such treatment that you would forget the meaning of the word peace. It would do you good. It would take some of your high notions out of you. But I am not ready to send you there yet, notwithstanding your ingratitude for all my kindness and forbearance. You have been the plague of my life. I wanted to make you happy, and I have been repaid with the basest ingratitude. But though you have proved yourself incapable of appreciating my kindness, I will be lenient towards you, Linda. I will give you one more chance to redeem your character. If you behave yourself and do as I require, I will forgive you and treat you as I have always done. But if you disobey me, I will punish you as I would the meanest slave on my plantation. Never let me hear that fellow's name mentioned again. If I ever know of you speaking to him, I will cowhide you both. And if I catch him lurking on my premises, I will shoot him as I would a dog. Do you hear what I say? I'll teach you a lesson about marriage and free niggers. Now go, and let this be the last time I have occasion to speak on this subject." Reader, did you ever hate? I hope not. I never did but once, and I trust I never shall again. Somebody has called it the atmosphere of hell, and I believe it is so. For a fortnight, the doctor did not speak to me. He thought to mortify me, to make me feel that I had disgraced myself by receiving the honorable addresses of a respectable colored man in preference to the base proposals of a white man. But though his lips disdained to address me, his eyes were very loquacious. No animal ever watched his prey more narrowly than he watched me. He knew that I could write, though he failed to make me read his letters, and now he troubled lest I should exchange letters with another man. After a while he became weary of silence, and I was sorry for it. One morning, as he passed through the hall to leave the house, he contrived to thrust a note in my hand. I thought I better read it and spare myself the vexation of having him read it to me. It expressed regret for the blow he gave me, and reminded me that I myself was wholly to blame for it. He hoped that I had convinced myself during this injury that I caused his displeasure. He wrote that he had made up his mind to go to Louisiana, that he should take several slaves with him, and intended that I should be one of them. My mistress would remain where she was. Therefore, I should have nothing to fear from that quarter. If I merited kindness from him, he assured that I would be lavishly bestowed upon me. He begged me to think over the matter and answer the following day. The next morning I was called to carry a pair of scissors to his room. I laid them on the table with the letter beside them. He thought it was my answer and did not call me back. I went as usual to attend to my young mistress to and from school. He met me in the street and ordered me to stop at his office on my way back. When I entered, he showed me his letter and asked why I had not answered it. I replied, "I am your daughter's property, and it is in your power to send me or take me wherever you please." He said he was very glad to find me so willing to go, and that we should start early in the autumn. He had a large practice in the town, and I rather thought he had made up the story merely to frighten me. However that might be, I was determined that I would never go to Louisiana with him. Summer passed away, and early in the autumn, Dr. Flint's eldest son was sent to Louisiana to examine the country with a view to immigrating. That news did not disturb me. I knew very well that I should not be sent with him, that I had not been taken to the plantation before time, was owing to the fact that his son was there. He was very jealous of his son, and jealousy of the overseer had kept him from punishing me by sending me into the fields to work. Is it strange that I was not proud of these protections? As for the overseer, he was a man whom I had lost respect for more than a bloodhound. Young Mr. Flint did not bring back a favorable report from Louisiana, and I heard no more of that scheme. Soon after this, my lover met me at the corner on the street, and I stopped to speak to him. Looking up, I saw my master watching us from the window. I hurried home, trembling with fear. I was sent for immediately to go to his room. He met me with the blow. "When is mistress to be married?" said he in a sneering tone. A shower of oaths and imprecations followed. How thankful I was that my lover was a free man, that my tyrant had no power to flog him for speaking to me in the streets. Again and again I revolved in my mind how this all would end. There was no hope that the doctor would consent to sell me on any terms. He had an iron will and was determined to keep me and to conquer me. My lover was an intelligent and religious man. Even if he could have obtained permission to marry me while I was a slave, the marriage would have given him no power to protect me from my master. It would have made him miserable to witness the insults that I should have been subjected to. And then, if we had children, I knew they must follow the condition of the mother. What a terrible blight that would have been on a free heart, an intelligent father. For his sake, I thought I ought not to link his fate with my own unhappy destiny. He was going to Savannah to see about some property left by an uncle, and hard as it was to bring my feelings to it, I earnestly entreated him not to come back. I advised him to go to the free states, where his tongue would not be tied, and where his intelligence would be more avail to him. He left me, still hoping the day would come when I would be bought. With the lamp of hope gone out, the dream of my girlhood was over. I felt lonely and desolate. Still, I was not stripped of all. I still had my good grandmother and my affectionate brother. When he put his arms around my neck and looked into my eyes, as if to read their troubles I dared not tell, I felt that I had something to love. But even that pleasant emotion was chilled by the reflection that he might be torn away from me at any moment by some sudden freak of my master. If he had known how we loved each other, I think he would have exulted in separating us. We often planned together how we would go to the north, but as William remarked, such things are easier said than done. My movements were very closely watched, and we had no means of getting any money to defray our expenses. As for grandmother, she was strongly opposed to her children undertaking any such projects. She had not forgotten Benjamin's sufferings, and she was afraid that if another child tried to escape, he would have a similar or worse fate. To me, nothing seemed more dreadful than my present life. I said to myself, William must be free. He shall go to the north, and I will follow him. Many a slave sister has formed that same plan.
Hello, my name is Maria of MariaMariaInc. Please like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications for next week's installments of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. I humbly thank you for your time. Have a wonderful day. See you later.